Hello everyone, my name is Jody Shipka. Sorry that I couldn't be there with you in real time today. Earlier today I had some dental work done. I wasn't sure how that might impact my ability to speak with you during your actual class session. So I made this instead.
I indicated earlier that I love memoirs, and in many respects, that's what this book is for me. Research I was living. I think Jeff Sirk makes a distinction between what one is working on versus working in. And this book was definitely a reflection of what I was working in, an accounting, however partial, of what I was thinking about, doing, trying, struggling with, and learning at a specific point in time, mainly between 1998 and 2005 or so. Another thing that still resonates with me, and perhaps my favorite part of the book, is the cover art. I created the original images in 2008 when I converted a Brownie Hawkeye flash camera into a pinhole camera, a pinhawk. A couple years later, I was experimenting with a technique called window scanning, where you layer the negatives with various textured materials, and I came up with the actual cover image called Mind and Society. I felt the image represented much of what the book was about: experimentation, modification, bringing together the analog and the digital, and all with a nod, of course, to Vygotsky. If I have any regrets, things I wish I could have said or done, it would have to be with highlighting the terrific amount of experimentation and risk-taking going on at the time. And not just in terms of what students were creating for major tasks, but in rethinking what class sessions might actually look and sound like, what they might entail. Students were, and still are in fact, coming up with amazingly smart, active, and interactive ways of dealing with course readings in their in-class group presentations. It's rarely a matter of coming to class and just sitting there discussing what we read, but a matter of putting those readings into action, into activity. I was also doing a lot of experimentation with the way I responded to student work, and also with ideas for having students exchange their work mid-process, to have another person pick up their traces and finish or remediate what they had started. In short, I was doing far more thinking about things like distributed agency, authorship, and multimodal response than the book probably suggests. In the end, I was afraid that highlighting these experiments would potentially alienate readers, making them think I had gone way, way, way too far. The biggest changes have to do with the range of courses I'm teaching and who I'm working with. Here in the English department at UMBC, we have a Ret Comp undergrad track, or as it is named, a Communications and Technology track. So I've been able to apply and adapt the pedagogy for a much wider range of classes. A seminar in creativity and play theory, an intro course for the track called Texts and Contexts, a course on theories of communication and technology, just to name a few. As a grad student, I was always and only teaching first-year comp, in part because it was one of the few classes available for grads to teach, but also as a matter of choice. I enjoyed teaching first-year comp, and while working on my dissertation and thinking about this approach to composing, I wanted to at least constrain that variable. Another key difference was that as a grad student at the University of Illinois, I rarely had English majors in my class and really came to enjoy and appreciate the range of backgrounds and interests students brought to the class. In asking students to think about the kinds of writing, or more broadly stated, composing, that they were doing in their majors or anticipated doing once they got out of school, I learned a lot. Another difference, one I touched on to start, and this may well just be time, distorted memory, and nostalgia speaking, is that I think I took way more risks as a grad student. There was this sense, at least as I recall, of never knowing what would happen, a sense of trying things to see if and where they might go. And that was both scary at times and thrilling. But I also felt much more alone and more vulnerable. This is not to say that I lacked support for this experimentation or was ever told that I couldn't teach the way I was teaching, and this is something I am extremely grateful for. Still, I think my perception of this being a risky endeavor, of always having to think about how I would justify what I was doing, made for much more intense class sessions and bonds with students. I can remember occasions saying to students, I don't know about this. People aren't going to get it. People will just think that we're messing around, being wacky, as opposed to working hard or learning anything. That what we're doing isn't at all academic or rhetorically sound. As a grad student, I didn't see many people doing what I was doing. Back in 1998, 1999, there weren't tons of people, at least not that I knew of or that I had read, that I could cite and point to say, see, this person is advocating this too. This, of course, changed when I switched my focus from lit to writing studies and began reading Cirque, Bridwell Bowles, and others. Complicating things was that I had also kind of internalized this idea that first-year comp courses should be about scholarly alphabetic texts, underlying thesis statements, topic sentences, MLA citation practices. So a lot of the time I felt like what I was doing was really wrong. I mean, it made sense in terms of lived experience and how students seemed to engage with tasks and class materials, how they appeared to be thinking so much more flexibly and purposefully about composing, about the choices they were and were not making. But again, it often felt wrong, like I was always on the verge of being in big trouble and that no one would ever hire me to do this kind of work. What I'm having to keep in mind these days, after teaching this way for nearly 20 years now, is that while things don't always feel as risky today as they did back in 1999 or 2000, that they might still feel that way for some, or even most students. Students who might only or mostly be accustomed to producing an academic text that looks and sounds a certain way. By way of example, at this point in time, I have seen my fair share of board games or multi-part activity kits as research-based academic arguments. I've learned both that and how it might be possible to create such a thing. But for the student who hadn't seen this done, hadn't considered it possible, or is trying their hand at it for the first time, it's helpful to think about how I felt and where I was when students first showed me that these kind of things were possible, and how thrilling and scary that realization could be. This is not to say that I'm not seeing or experiencing new things in the classroom. In point of fact, I am. We've had class sessions where instead of trading on talk or written text, we communicate only through gesture and playing segments of songs in order to communicate with one another. And just last semester, a presenting group hosted an entire class mediated by Siri. And here's a bit of what that pretty crazy terrific session looked and sounded like.
Please take out your phone or tablet, if you have one, and your questions. Turn to your questions. Today I have a lecturer, Domenica, Ryan, and Kimberly will assist when needed.
What is our purpose on this planet?
If you have any questions today, you have to ask me. I will try to answer them, or I won't. It depends on the question. Does everybody understand? You can't ask Domenica, Ryan, or Kimberly questions. For much of this class, you will work in your assigned groups so that everyone has access to the needed technology. You will now be split into groups.
So who should I sit with?
Because, I'm sorry, I'm not talking to you. Who do I sit with? Because Catherine and I are two. Go to like a group of 4. I'm so sorry.
Sit with a group of 4, yes.
It's Tuesday.
Hey Siri, I hate you.
Well, I'm still here for you.
That's the team, not the
Coaches.
list of coaches.
Washington Capitals coaching history.
Just say past coaches of
The Washington Capitals. I know the current one.
Barry Trotz coaches the
I
Capitals.
know he does now.
oh, whooping.
Fucking hell. I can give them all to you without doing this.
Just go history of the Capitals. Maybe you'll get coaching history.
Coaching history of the Washington Capitals. I can answer without doing this. That's not what I asked, Siri. You're killing me, Siri.
Take me to Obama's Twitter.
Isn't there?
Holy shit.
Always gotta ask a woman.
This is why I don't. Why they beat Redskins?
What is Obama doing today?
Would have known that. Like the last 5 weeks. Or what is on his schedule?
What? Just kidding.
Found on the web for why isn't what is Obama doing today?
What about,
You
I
hold
don't
it.
know. Oh, obviously I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what to ask. What are we doing? We're doing
Whichever one.
Whichever one.
We still need 3.
Do we have 2?
We don't.
Oh no,
Rick's
no,
faster.
no, we don't.
Why don't you type in the terminal? It's faster.
On the web for Grim Master.
So while I welcome opportunities to see something or try something I'd not done or seen done before, I need to remain mindful of those for whom the idea of creating an argument as a board game or a performance or a scrapbook feels really new, different, risky, and scary. One disadvantage of my creating a video response instead of Skyping in is that I'm not able to ask a follow-up question about a question before responding. So apologies in advance if my response to this question isn't helpful or at all in keeping with what the question poser had in mind. I am likely heading in a different direction here from what he or she might have had in mind. Generally speaking, my approach to the text context question is to consider how a text, regardless of what it's comprised of, is simultaneously shaped by and provides shape for the context in which it's produced, circulated, responded to, and valued. So rather than think of text as a mode, I encourage students to think about a text as a thing, defining it as something that has been purposefully created, engineered, or designed to do a certain kind of work, and this gets to questions of rhetorical function or effect, for a specific audience or situation. To have students begin considering how a particular kind of text is shaped by and provides shape for context, we often use rhetorical function, the work a text does, as a point of entry. So say the goal is to communicate something of one's life to a particular audience, a broad objective to be sure. We begin by thinking about and listing all the texts that could fulfill that function: a diary, a blog, a home movie, a resume, CV, autobiography, biography, obituary, a record of what one has purchased on eBay, debit card transactions, and so on. From this point, we can discuss how and for whom the various texts on the list function, how a particular kind of text aligns with or fails to align with certain expectations, conventions, and socio-historical practices. Again, how texts take shape from and provide shape to context. To be sure, and this is a point I underscore in the final sentences of my book, there are times or occasions that texts comprised primarily of alphabetic texts will be viewed as the most fitting or appropriate for a particular situation. What's important, however, is to consider that there are still other ways to accomplish the same or a similar communicative objective. Again, as I write at the end of the book, a composition made whole is concerned with attending to the ways in which individuals work with, as well as against, the mediational means they employ in hopes that this will empower them to choose wisely, critically, and purposefully the relationships, structures, and representational systems that are most fitting or appropriate given the purposes, potentials, and contexts of one's work. Speaking of choosing wisely the representational systems that are most fitting for the purposes and potentials and contexts of one's work, it's probably a good time to address the question about Muffy's project. How writing was instrumental to the overall process but didn't actually show up in the final project. There was certainly a reflective component for the dance, but at the time I worked with Muffy, I don't think it was the kind of more fully fleshed out statement that I'm having students come up with now. If memory serves, there was a time that I had students respond to questions about their work in class, doing it as a kind of in-class free write. I happened to interview Muffy as part of my dissertation project, which is how I learned as much as I did about her history with writing, her overall process for the dance, and when and where writing played a role in that project. In terms of multimodal statements of goals and choices, I never ask for them. What's more, the requirements associated with the statements, that there's a word limit, that it's composed in chart form, etc., suggest my expectation that they will, in fact, be alphabetic word process texts. That said, I have mentioned them as a possibility in the past. Again, if memory serves, only one person has taken me up on that. My sense is that the statements of goals and choices are the last things students compose before a task is due, and I think for many of them, the thought of coming up with a multimodal version would just be way too much. They can fulfill the requirements of this part of the task, I'm guessing, most easily or efficiently if they write up their responses to the questions. And just as an aside, another reason why I've been okay with having students compose written statements is that it's helped satisfy written page requirements associated with some classes. So as a grad student, students needed to compose X number of pages of polished writing, and the statements help fulfill that requirement. They've also proven really useful in terms of allowing other people to see or read the choices students are making or choosing not to make with their work, and to do so in a manner others are used to dealing with, namely words on a page. I am increasingly inviting people to submit, along with their statements of goals and choices, images or video clips of their composing process. Oftentimes in class, a student will talk about how they created something, and sometimes I can't get my head around what that process might have looked like, how they did something. Take, for example, this incredible multi-part rhetorical event. The students composed bits of her argument on a saw, a scroll, clay tablets, and she even knit part of her argument. I would have given anything to have video of her composing process for some of these texts. Here, for the sake of time, I'm going to try and link as a way of responding to a couple of the questions. One about the dominance of or expectation that students will produce alphabetic texts in the comp course. One about translating approaches, and a question about remediation as a class exercise and whether there are any benefits to choosing the forms or modes students work with. Firstly, as to the expectation that students should or will produce alphabetic texts in a comp or writing course, I have to say that I do think it's important. As a grad student and now with this job, I've been housed in English departments where there is still an expectation that students will compose alphabetic texts. Thus, students I've worked with have done and will likely continue to do a lot of writing. That said, alphabetic text, word-based writings, appear in a lot of places and can serve many different rhetorical functions, as work in fields like writing studies and Rhet Comp have taught us. And that's what I want my students to think about, not just one kind of writing, but many, many kinds of writing. Texts comprised mainly or only of words, as well as those that combine words with other semiotic resources. I want them to think about and practice using language, spoken and or written, effectively, purposefully, playfully, and with a mind toward how that use impacts others. I would hope that the discipline continues to move away from the expectation that smart, engaged, rigorous, academic or scholarly work can only look or sound one way, can only assume certain forms, and I think now of print-based, linear, argumentative, research-based texts. In terms of translating approaches, I hesitate to say too much here since I don't have any major assignments or assignment sequences that require students to translate a written text to one comprised mainly or entirely of visuals or sounds. Oftentimes, what students choose to create for major tasks has them combining various modes or media. I do see value, however, in doing in-class activities that ask students to translate, say, a written text into images or sounds or movement, or vice versa. Recently, for an in-class activity, I had students come to class with research they had collected on a subject I had given them. The subjects were actually ones I took from a Comp Ret textbook published in 1854. When they got to class, I had students working in groups of 2 or 3 find a way to communicate something about the topic they researched using only emoji. Translating activities like this provide opportunities to experience and reflect on the affordances of what they began with and what they ended up with. In terms of the question about remediation as a class exercise and whether it's better to assign students a different medium to work with or have them choose, I'd be more inclined to choose for them if it were for an in-class activity than I would for a major or final project. With the latter, I want students to choose representational forms that make sense for the work they mean to do. That said, I encourage students to use the major tasks as opportunities or even excuses to try something new. All this said, I remain mindful of institutional and curricular constraints. As I mentioned earlier, the Statement of Goals and Choices has served and continues to serve a number of functions for me. It gives me insight into students' composing processes, helps me align better with what they're attempting to do both rhetorically and materially as I'm assessing and responding to their work, but also in cases where students are expected to produce X many pages of writing, they help fulfill that requirement too. It could be that assignments or sequences that have students translating text to image or sound fulfill a similar function, and as the person asking the question notes, this might make for a good entry point for teachers who are more accustomed to thinking about reading and responding to linear alphabetic texts. And I'll end here with this question. As posed, it read, so many are quick to distinguish with those who do multimodal work, especially in graduate research networks, whether this or that, whether the graduate student's research is more like Jody Shipka or insert person here, often digital/multimedia centric. How do you respond to that? In other words, do you see yourself as quite different from compositionists who focus on multimodality? And at the risk of sounding naive or out of the loop, how I respond to that is, really? That goes on? That can go on? Again, if I were Skyping with you today, I'd likely ask a follow-up question or 2 or 3 before responding to this. But I guess I'm glad that there are enough of us out there doing multimodal work for grad students to identify more with so-and-so or with such and such an approach. Again, when I started out, it was much more about finding anybody doing similar work, whether in the field or not. And I think that for me it was more about locating kindred spirits, folks I could learn from and cite in my own work, than determining whether my research or the work I was doing was more like this person or that. Clearly there were certain affinities, and I really liked the direction that Jeff Sirk was going, but for me it was just gathering up people who I felt I could relate to and learn from. So, do I see myself quite different from others who focus on multimodality? I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, one's background, temperament, experiences, current positioning, and so on make us all very different kinds of scholars and workers, subject to different institutional and curricular expectations. But in terms of others who focus on or identify as doing multimodal work, it depends on who one has in mind. And again, this might be a follow-up question that I would ask, but I can say, do I define multimodality as including but not limited to the digital? Yes. Do I like working with 3D objects, live performances, as well as digital media? Absolutely. Do I believe, for lack of a better way of putting it, that being multimodal or doing multimodality is a full-time job, a way of being and living and making meaning? This is opposed to something that one might do just for an assignment or two? Yes. And I guess it's the last point that concerns me most, the fear that people will identify as or claim to do multimodal work, but treat it as something one only does now and then, or only for an assignment or two.